How's it going, folks? Welcome to the second part of the Master and Margarita. The dog just barked. Is that coming through on the mic? She'll do it again. I just have to crack on. So this is looking at chapters 6 to 9. And I've got the subtitle here of There Was No Worse Misfortune in the World Than the Loss of One's Reason. So obviously they are talking about Bies Domini, or are we? So I'm just going to read my essay out. It's going to go out as a podcast so that you can listen to it when you're out and about, because I do enjoy consuming Substack posts that way. Simon Hazel's been doing it with his War and Peace read along, which I appreciate. So that's why I'm doing it. And I'm also going to copy Matthew Long, who in his wonderful piece that went out this week called The Drowning Mind, he included a PDF download. So I'm going to see if I can figure out how to do that as well, so you can print it and take it away and read it offline. Right, so here's what I've written. Enjoy. How are you enjoying your reading? The story moves along in week 2 in the aftermath of Berlioz's decapitation by tram and Ivan Bies Domini's incarceration in the psychiatric clinic. All 4 chapters are the so-called Moscow chapters, with no more trips to Yerushalayim, which of course we know is Jerusalem. So starting with chapter 6, titled Schizophrenia, Just As Has Been Said. And I've got an image here by Andrei Nabokov, which I've stolen from masterandmargarita.eu, which is a fun resource to look at. It's a very rich novel for illustrating, and there are a lot of illustrators out there who have come up with some wonderful drawings. So I'm planning to do a separate post on that at some point. We're at a psychiatric clinic recently built on the banks of the Moskva River. It's 1:30 a.m. We're with a poet called Ryukhin, who accompanied Bies Domini on his trip from Griboyedov to the clinic. The doctor comes in to see the patient and Bies Domini greets him. Quote, "Hi there, wrecker," replied Ivan maliciously and loudly. End quote. The doctor is unperturbed and asks Bies Domini how he is. Quote, "Honestly, you can all leave me alone and go to the devil," Ivan cried rudely and turned away. End quote. In Russian, the devil is invoked as a curse word far more often than in English. Nevertheless, it's an interesting choice of word here, given that Bies Domini has literally just come from the devil. A search of the Applin translation reveals that the word appears 78 times. It dawns on Ryukhin that Bies Domini might not actually be mad at all, and he worries that he's made a terrible mistake. Naturally, Bies Domini is aggrieved at his situation and lashes out angrily at Ryukhin and the doctor. The asylum is not a madhouse after all, but a clinic. The doctor informs Bies Domini that he won't be detained unless necessary. Quote, "A typical petty kulak in his psychology," began Ivan Nikolaevich, who was evidently impatient to denounce Ryukhin. "And a petty kulak, what's more, carefully disguising himself as a proletarian." We have some political slurs here that are very much of their time. You saw that Ivan called the doctor a wrecker. This was a common slur against enemies of the state who were found guilty of industrial sabotage or simply holding back enough grain from their crops to feed their families. A kulak was a peasant who owned a bit of land or a small amount of livestock. Stalin wanted to wipe out the kulaks as a class. He saw them as enemies of the state who were holding back progress. It was not a nice thing to be called, as it meant the NKVD, the secret police, would come for you and you'd be disappeared. During the grain requisition period, farmers had to fulfill impossible quotas on their crops, which led to a widespread famine known as the Holodomor in the rich lands of Ukraine. Holod comes from the Ukrainian word for hunger. Hiding grain for your family made you a kulak, or a wrecker. Bezdomny explains to the doctor that they ought to call the police right away and have them come with motorcycles and machine guns to capture Voland. He makes the call himself and the duty police officer duly hangs up on him. He's furious, but the doctor calls a nurse to give Bezdomny a sedative and he falls asleep. The doctor diagnoses schizophrenia and alcoholism. And there's our title. But remember that schizophrenia had been predicted. Ryukin heads back to Moscow with the truck driver as it's beginning to get light. I love the description of Moscow here in the early morning light. It brings some calm and some realism after the frantic scene at the clinic. Quote, "And now the forest had fallen away, been left somewhere behind, and the river had gone off to the side somewhere, and all kinds of different things came hurrying along to meet the truck. Fences of some kind with sentry boxes and pallets of firewood, great high poles and masts of some sort with threaded coils on the masts, piles of ballast, earth covered with the lines of channels. In short, there was the sense that here it was at any moment, Moscow, right here around this bend, and in a minute it would be upon you and envelop you." End quote. Ryukin feels bad. He eventually realises that it's Bezdomny's accusation that has unsettled him so deeply that he's a hack. Quote, "Yes, the poetry. He was 32. What, indeed, lay in the future? In the future, too, he would compose a few poems a year. Into old age? Yes, into old age. And what would those poems bring him? Fame? What nonsense. Don't deceive yourself, at least. Fame will never come to someone who composes bad poetry. Why is it bad? It was true what he said." Ryukin addressed himself pitilessly. "I don't believe in a thing of what I write." End quote. I can feel Bulgakov here, or indeed any Substack writer. Don't we all feel like hacks? We're told that Ryukin is suffering from, quote, "an explosion of neurasthenia," end quote. I had to look this up. It's a 19th century diagnosis of what we would classify today as anxiety, depression or chronic fatigue. As he approaches Moscow, he sees a statue of a metal man on a pedestal. This is the monument to Alexander Pushkin by A.M. Opiekushin, officially unveiled in 1880. This is another example of ostranenia, or defamiliarization, that we discussed in part 1. Bulgakov is taking a culturally recognisable monument and deliberately not naming it as Pushkin. Rather, he's reducing this artist to the material of which his monument is made. Ryukin can't understand what it was about Pushkin that made him so successful. Quote, "He was lucky, that white guard. He shot at him, smashed his hip to pieces and guaranteed his immortality." I've got here an image of the Pushkin monument on Pushkinskaya Square in Moscow. Think back to what Pilate thought to himself in chapter 2. Quote, "Immortality has come." End quote. We have an interesting view of immortality here from different sides. Pushkin is immortalised as a cultural icon, turned into cold metal to stand firm forever. He's an icon of Russia's literary greatness. However, Pushkin himself was a womanizer and a rogue who was eventually killed in a duel. Public opinion could have gone either way. His art is one thing, his behaviour another, a dichotomy that we still wrestle with today. Pilate was immortalised by his decision to hang Yeshua, while Pushkin's immortality is a celebration. Remember that Bulgakov already referenced Pushkin's Eugene Onegin in chapter 4 as a grounding influence amid the supernatural. Pushkin is immortalised positively and Pilate negatively. One is lauded for eternity, the other condemned or cancelled in today's parlance. Ryukin makes his way to Griboyedov, where he's greeted by Archibald Archibaldovich, the manager and pirate king of Griboyedov. In my earlier essay and video and podcast, I discussed this pirate as he appears in chapter 5 as a handsome black-eyed man in tails, and mistakenly assumed that Bulgakov was referring to Voland. Apologies for that. Chapter 7, A Bad Apartment. A new character is introduced, Stjopa Lichadiev. He's the director of the Variety Theatre. He's rudely awakened by Voland and he has a bad hangover. He's Berlioz's flatmate. Recall how Voland replied to Berlioz's question about where he was going to live. Quote, "How's that? But where are you going to be staying?" "Ah, in your apartment," the madman suddenly replied in an over-familiar tone and gave a wink. End quote. It looks like he wasn't kidding. The narrator gives us some of the flat's history and reputation. Its previous owner, Anna Frantsevna de Fougeray, was the widow of a respectable jeweller. She rented a room to 3 lodgers, all of whom disappeared under mysterious circumstances, until eventually both she and her maid, Anfisa, also disappeared. It's put down to, quote, witchcraft. And here's a quote. "Well, and witchcraft, as is well known, only has to start, and then you simply can't stop it with anything." Of course, this refers to the disappearance of the bourgeois as a class, with a knock at the door from the secret police and the confiscation of property. Were there really 25 large diamonds and gold coins in the firewood shed? Quote, "Well, what we don't know, we can't vouch for." End quote. So, this is the flat where Berlioz lived with his wife, along with Stjopa and his wife. It's not long before both of their wives disappear, although the husbands don't seem too put out by it. It gives the sense that people simply accept disappearances, and it's not the done thing to question it. Back to the hangover. Stjopa's feeling grim. He looks in the mirror only to see a stranger in his room. The stranger greets him, saying that it's not a painkiller he needs for his sore head, but a hair of the dog. There just happens to be some chilled vodka and snacks laid out for him. It is, of course, Voland. He reminds Stjopa that he'd signed a contract the day before for 7 performances at the Variety for the sum of 35,000 rubles, 10,000 of which Voland has already been paid. There was a receipt from the theatre's treasurer, Rimsky, to prove it. Stjopa goes to call Rimsky and, on his way to the phone, sees that Berlioz's room is sealed. He gets Rimsky on the phone, who confirms that the black magic show is going ahead as per the contract. At this point, Stjopa looks in the mirror and catches a glimpse of a man in pince-nez, then a black cat. He calls out to his maid Grunya to ask whose cat it is, to which Voland replies that the cat is his and that he, Voland, has sent Grunya off to Voronezh to visit her mother, as she'd been complaining that Stjopa never gave her any time off. Stjopa re-enters his room only to find the man in the pince-nez and the cat sitting, quote, with a shot glass of vodka in one paw and a fork on which he had managed to spear a pickled mushroom in the other. End quote. Quote, "And yet, there's nothing to be surprised about. This is my retinue." So that's a pull quote. Voland explains to Stjopa that there's one too many in the flat and that, surprise, surprise, it's Stjopa who is surplus to requirement. Pince-nez man, we don't yet know his name, talks of Stjopa's abuse of his position and the cat corroborates. At this point, a 4th character appears, the final addition to Voland's retinue, Azazello. He has fiery red hair and a fang sticking out of his mouth, which, quote, disfigured a physiognomy that was already of unprecedented loathsomeness, end quote. What a description. The cat shoos Stjopa and he disappears, only to awaken in Yalta. And then I've got an image here of Koroviev, Azazello and Behemoth, so those are the 3 characters in the retinue, by Christopher Cohn Askew for Penguin Random House. And this is an image I hadn't seen before till I kind of got carried away on Pinterest and found it. It's done in the same style as the artwork of the Penguin Deluxe Classics edition. So it looks like this was done for that, but then not used. And it's a terrific image. I urge you, if you're watching the video or listening to the podcast, to go on to the... In fact, if you're watching the video, I'll put it in so you can see it. Chapter 8. The Duel Between Professor and Poet. Bezdobny wakes up in the clinic and, for a moment, forgets where he is. When he realises, he's reminded of Berlioz's death, but he feels better after resting. He sees a call button beside him and, quote, out of a habit of touching things needlessly, he pressed it, end quote. Isn't that a lovely detail? We're introduced to some technology that made me think of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, but it's flipped. Is Bulgakov evoking this idea deliberately? Absolutely. In Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, curiosity is rewarded with growth. When Alice sees the signs reading "Eat me" and "Drink me," she can change sides and continue exploring her environment. In Biesdomny's case, these commands are about control. He has told the truth and has been institutionalised for telling it. And remember the Queen of Hearts' sentence to Alice? Off with her head! The narrator tells us that Biesdomny has some luck and, on pressing the call button, a, quote, plump, nice-looking woman in a clean white coat, end quote, enters and greets him. Good morning. Quote, Ivan did not reply, for he considered this greeting inappropriate in the circumstances. Indeed, they had confined a healthy man in a clinic and were pretending, what's more, that that was the way things ought to be. End quote. He does feel like he's in some kind of sci-fi wonderland outside of reality. He's well and truly down the rabbit hole. The nurse even tells him that, quote, such equipment isn't to be found anywhere, not even abroad. Scientists and doctors come here especially to see our clinic. We have foreign tourists here every day, end quote. Is this a nod to Soviet industrialisation and progress? Perhaps. Biesdomny sees before him three paths. The first is to smash up all the fancy equipment, but no, then he might be confirmed as a violent madman. The second is to tell the truth of what he saw the day before, once again. But he already knows the consequences of that. So he opts for the third, silence. The narrator tells us he didn't manage to realise them completely, meaning not at all. Biesdomny is asked all kinds of questions and notes are taken on his responses. After the questions, he's subjected to a medical examination and then let go for breakfast. A retinue led by Dr. Stravinsky enters. That's three characters now named after famous composers: Berlioz, Stravinsky and Rimsky, after Rimsky-Korsakov. Biesdomny as a holy fool and disciple. Critic Laura D. Weeks discusses the main characters through the lens of Christian iconography and theology, and I'm finding it utterly fascinating. For example, Ivan Biesdomny may be considered the holy fool character in the novel, which for me brought to mind the story of the three brothers in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. It might bring to mind other examples of the three brothers trope for you. My wife jumped straight to the Three Billy Goats Gruff. Quote, like Margarita, the poet Ivan Biesdomny originates in a purely Russian context. His dishevelled appearance, his awkwardness and his habit of stumbling on the truth mark him as Ivanushka the Fool, archetypical hero of Russian folk tales. And I've got an image here of a book cover which is called Pro Ivanushku Durachka, Ruska Narodna Skazka. So it's Ivanushka the Fool, a Russian folk tale. Biesdomny knows the truth, and in telling it he makes himself appear at the least foolish, if not mad. For this he is incarcerated. Disciple. Weeks makes a convincing case for Biesdomny's being a parody of a disciple. A disciple of whom, exactly? Of the truth, perhaps? So far we've seen his appearance at Griboyedov in rags after his, quote, baptism in the Moskva River, a possible reference to John the Baptist. I had wondered what the whole diving in the river scene was all about, and this may explain it. In the clinic, he renounces his life as a poet 3 times, though for the moment we know only of the first. Quote, you're a poet? I am, Ivan replied gloomily, and for the first time suddenly felt an inexplicable kind of revulsion for poetry. And what came to mind straight away of his own verse seemed for some reason unpleasant. End quote. Weeks suggests that this is a reference to Peter's 3 denials of Christ before the cock crows. Dr. Stravinsky interviews Bezdomny and agrees to let him leave if he can only tell him that he's sane. This he does. However, Stravinsky instructs the nurse not to change the bed sheets, indicating that Bezdomny will be back within 2 hours. Bezdomny said his first port of call would be the police station to report the consultant and relate the pilot story to them. So, naturally, the police will just bring him back to the clinic. Stravinsky persuades Bezdomny to stay and rest. He can relate the pilot story in writing and rest assured that the consultant will be caught in due course. It looks like Bezdomny is going to be incarcerated for quite some time. Chapter 9. Koroviev's Tricks. Now things are getting interesting. We're introduced to a new character, Nikanor Ivanovich Basoy, chairman of the housing association of the building in which the late Berlioz lived. Upon being notified of Berlioz's death, Nikanor Ivanovich sealed his flat. The word of Berlioz's death spread quickly, and Nikanor Ivanovich is soon bombarded with requests to take over the flat. This is indicative of the acute housing shortage in Soviet Russia, particularly in Moscow. Living space was more valuable than money, which of course led to corruption and bribery, which we'll see in a minute. Berlioz's flat would have been of particular interest as it was large and centrally located. Flat 50 is on Bolshaya Sadovaya Street on the Garden Ring and is now home to the Bulgakov Museum, and I've included a link there to a map. Nikanor Ivanovich unlocks the door to flat 50 and is shocked to discover a stranger seated at the late Berlioz's desk. It's the same man that Berlioz saw at Patriarch's Ponds, the one with the pince-nez and checked trousers. Nikanor Ivanovich asks the stranger if he's an official, to which we get this delightful Bulgakovian response, quote, "What is someone official or someone unofficial? It all depends on the point of view you look at the matter from. It's all variable and conditional, Nikanor Ivanovich. Today I'm someone official, but tomorrow, lo and behold, I'm unofficial. And sometimes it's the other way round. And how?" End quote. It perfectly sums up Stalinist Moscow. How official you are depends on the whim of the decision maker. If you get results, you may remain official. Otherwise, you may be made unofficial. Status can be applied retroactively. Remember the elasticity of Article 58 of the Soviet Criminal Code that we discussed before. Or Pilate's immortality based on his decision regarding Yeshua. It wasn't Yeshua's actions that led to Pilate's condemnation, but how those actions might be perceived. Pilate could be unofficialized at the drop of a hat, and that's where fear lives. Although Koroviev, as the stranger introduces himself, seems unperturbed by the designation of status one way or the other, seeing it for what it is. Koroviev explains that Nikanor Ivanovich had agreed to let the flat to Voland and his retinue, and has a signed document in his briefcase to that effect. Apparently, Berlioz's flatmate, Stepan Bogdanovich Likhodzeyev, had agreed to this and then left for Yalta. This we've already seen. Remember Styopa from above? Russian names, am I right? Koroviev invites Nikanor Ivanovich to call the Foreign Tourist Office right away to square things away officially. It turns out that they already knew of the arrangement, much to Nikanor Ivanovich's surprise. Koroviev and Nikanor Ivanovich talk money. Nikanor Ivanovich thinks of pushing his luck and names the sum of 500 rubles a day, coming to 3,500 for the week. Rather than balk at the sum, Koroviev requests a receipt for 5,000 rubles. At this point, Koroviev makes a couple of quips that I thought would be interesting to look up. Translating idioms is always challenging. So in the Russian we've got Денежка short Lyubit as the first one. And the second is Svой глазок смотрок, or Svой глазок смотрок, probably. So Glennie has just translated one of them, and he's got this statement: to the accompaniment of witticisms from Koroviev of the, quote, better safe than sorry variety. Burgeon O'Connor has got a penny saved is a penny earned, and a fool and his money are soon parted. Pavir and Volokhonsky has got Cash Loves Counting and Your Own Eye Won't Lie. Carpelson has Coin Loves Counting, Your Own Eye Doesn't Lie, very similar to Pavir and Volokhonsky. And Applin has Cash Loves to Be Counted and Your Own Eye's the Best Spy. So that's a different rhyme for I spy versus I lie. Isn't Michael Glennie's rendering interesting? I mean, fair enough, sometimes idioms just don't translate, at least literally. Burgeon O'Connor has found equivalent idioms, or at least adjacent ones. So I've got that set out in table form in the essay. Nicanor Ivanovic then asks for a free pass to the show for him and his wife, which he gets, along with, quote, a thick wad that made a crackling noise, end quote. The good old bribe. He weakly refuses the bribe, but there are no witnesses, and in any case, a miracle then ensues. Quote, the wad crawled into his briefcase all by itself, end quote. Nicanor Ivanovic then finds himself in the stairwell outside the door of the flat. He realises that he hadn't even asked how Voland and his retinue got into the flat through the sealed door. He's struck by a pang of conscience or, quote, a needle of disquiet, end quote, but shrugs it off and leaves. A voice then issues from the flat, stating that Nicanor Ivanovic is a rogue and a cheat, and something should be done to ensure that he doesn't come round again. Koroviev makes a call to inform the authorities that Nicanor Ivanovic is a currency speculator, a rather serious crime in Soviet Russia. And guess what happens? Yep, a couple of secret police goons show up at Nicanor Ivanovic's flat and find the wad, which, of course, just happens to be foreign currency. He protests his innocence and goes to his briefcase to retrieve the contract, but it's not there. Nor is Stepan Bogdanovic's letter or the foreigner's passport. It's all disappeared, as if by magic. So things aren't looking good for Nicanor Ivanovic, are they? Aye. So there we leave this week's reading. It's been interesting, quite fast-paced. A lot of comedy, I think, the way that Bulgakov writes. His style is kind of funny, I think. I wonder if you feel that too. Let me know in the comments what you think about that. So we'll leave it there for this week. I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am. If you've got any questions for me, best place is going to be my Substack, where the essay goes out. So you can come over there and drop a comment on the essay. Let me know how you're enjoying it. If you've got any feedback on what I've just written here or recorded for you, I'd be keen to hear from you. Otherwise, I'll see you next week for the next instalment. Thanks for watching / listening / reading. See you later.